Firstly, the energy transition and climate change is an opportunity more than a burden. Being energy secure for a country is indispensable. As we said at the beginning, the more energy equals the more GDP, and the more GDP, the wealthier are the citizens in your country.
On that point, isn't nuclear power quite a concentrated and small piece of land that they use for the amount of energy they generate? So isn't that quite efficient?
Especially as we move towards a world where AI is becoming the everyday tool. Being able to have companies allowed to develop data centers can put the UK in an economically position that it's unique and advantageous compared to the rest of the world.
Okay, hey everybody, my name's Ross.
And I'm Fede.
And today we are two humans talking about what is the future of energy? Fossil fuels, nuclear, or renewables?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Ross. It is very nice to be talking about energy. I'm a PhD student at UCL, studying the energy transition, so how the UK is incorporating more renewable power in the power grid and how this will help the UK become a decarbonized economy by the year 2030.
Yeah. Could you introduce the concept of energy in the grid a little bit? I mean, everybody knows that it exists, obviously, but could you kind of set it out as the situation lies right now?
Yes. The energy sector is one of the most important sectors in every economy and in every country. The energy sector has been studied for several decades. And the most important thing to know about the energy sector is that the GDP of a country is proportional to how much energy they produce. If we think about the most productive countries in Europe, whether we talk about France or Germany, they have an extremely large amount of energy being produced. France produces twice as much energy as they consume because they have a lot of nuclear power plants, and Germany has a lot of coal and wind that allows them also to produce a lot of energy that then is used in their manufacturing industry, such as their car making industries and many other businesses. Now, energy is also one of the sectors that produce the most pollution. When we burn coal, gas, oil, the amount of CO2 and other gases that is released into the atmosphere changes the balance between different gases, and this therefore impacts the different climates around the world. It affects how much radiation is trapped from the sun, and therefore it affects temperatures. This is something that is well known and has been studied for over 100 years. Now, the reason why most countries have agreed to move towards renewable energy and new forms of renewable power rather than sticking with fossil fuels, it's because, first of all, renewable energies are cheaper and they're more sustainable long term. And secondly, because we want to preserve the environment and make sure that these climate changes don't affect our civilizations.
Sounds great. I mean, what's the current situation right now with climate change? Obviously, this is something I've heard since I was a kid. It's something that people have been aware of, as you say, for 100 years. What's the latest data? Is it showing signs of acceleration? Is it starting to cause problems?
Okay, climate change is a really challenging topic because sometimes it can take several years to see the impact onto our environment. And one other thing that people sometimes don't understand is that when we talk about 1 degree above the baseline or 1.5 degrees above the baseline, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single location on Earth will witness an increase in temperature by 1 degree or by 1.5 degrees. It just means that on average, across the globe, there will be this increase in temperature. Now, this can happen not only that the temperature increases, but the variability in climate events changes. And changes drastically. So the same way that we can have more rigid winters or hotter summers or extreme precipitation or extreme droughts, this is a consequence of the change of the climate. So the fact that we talk about 1 degree is just a way to quantify, but there are many catastrophic events from a climate perspective that can be used to quantify climate change. Now,
yeah. Is this something that we've seen now? I'm not a climate scientist. I don't know if we've measured it, an increase recently. You may not be super expert on this either.
Yeah, I study more the energy side and not the climate impact. And it is a very difficult sector to work in because there is a lot of climate events that are not necessarily related to climate change. There is just a certain probability of these events happening, and there is many cycles taking place, from precipitations to currents to many other things. And so it's really difficult to identify by how much some of these events have been amplified in their impact because of climate change. But it is agreed, even if it is difficult to quantify by how much the impact has been amplified, we know that climate change is a lot more intense because of the amount of pollution that has been emitted in the atmosphere.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it in the news recently about a lot more extreme weather events that have been put down to that. But I just didn't know if it had been measured precisely recently. But I guess where I'm going with this is that the first thing I wanted to ask about the renewable energy picture at the moment is that we've seen a lot of governments in the world kind of moving back towards fossil fuels because, yeah, electricity from renewables might be cheaper to buy the electricity, but fossil fuels are kind of treated as a natural resource asset that's being wasted by governments such as the UK has talked about reopening its North Sea oil, or sorry, not reopening it, but expanding it. It's seen as kind of a resource to sell that's not being utilized as much as it could be. And so the country's not making as much money as it could be in some perspectives, probably not shared by many people.
Yeah, I think energy is extremely important. I think we established that. And there is strong political narratives and loads of lobbyists that want to push decisions in the energy sector towards one direction. Let's say that the war in Iran and a few other events that have happened over the past few years, such as COVID pandemic, Russian invasion of Ukraine, have helped this narrative to be portrayed as one potential solution. So in the case of the Strait of Hormuz, if we don't have gas coming from Iran, then why isn't the UK using the reserves that are in the North Sea? We've seen that Norway, for example, has increased the price of their gas, and they are selling it all over Europe. And this is almost hypocritical of Norway because it's a country that is 98% fueled by renewable, but they still extract the gas to sell it to the countries that don't have renewable. So from an environmental perspective, there is no reason why we should be using gas, considering that renewable energies are cheaper and they can be developed pretty much everywhere in Europe. However, fossil fuel have only one advantage, really, which is the only leg on which they stand, which is the fact that they are dispatchable power, which means that you can store it anywhere you want and you can turn it on, off, and regulate how much of it is turned into power at any given time, which is something that you cannot do with renewables. So, for example, if you have solar, obviously the sun shines throughout the day, but not at night. And that's why renewables require the use of batteries. So, generally speaking, it's always good to have about 5% of your power mix coming from fossil fuels, because in case of emergency, it can be a source of power. But from an environmental perspective, cost perspective, development perspective, it doesn't really make sense.
So are you saying that it's cheaper, what for what, or whatever the unit is that people would compare in this scenario, to use renewables than it is for fossil fuels? And when you consider all the building and the infrastructure and the construction and, all these things that add cost to it, it's actually still cheaper to use renewables. I'm actually completely don't know the answer to this.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting discussion point. So when we talk about fossil fuels or renewable energy, the two numbers to keep in mind are CapEx and OpEx. So capital expenditure and operational expenditure. In the case of fossil fuel, coal, many types of gas, usually the CapEx cost is relatively low. So it's really inexpensive to get going and to start with building the initial infrastructure. However, the operation cost, which is what you need to extract the oil, transport it, store it properly, and then burn it to generate power, is the most expensive part of the process. If we then look at renewable energy, the capital expenditure, so the capital that you need to put up front, is relatively expensive, but then renewables don't require you to get any primary resource. You don't need to buy the wind and you don't need to buy the sun. And they just keep spinning day and night, and you don't have to pay anybody to be actively operating the wind farms. So if we think about it into a graph with the x-axis being time and the y-axis being the cost of the asset, what happens is that fossil fuels start at a much lower point because they cost very little, but then they have a steeper growth in cost. While renewable energy starts much higher, but then they have a flatter. And so from an investor perspective, there is a risk when investing in renewable energy to put a lot of capital up front, and so you have a high opportunity cost, but then that cost doesn't grow as much. And if you're investing into fossil fuels, it's very easy to get going, but then your cost grows over time. So for the first few years, it's less expensive for an investor to be developing fossil fuel or gas turbines rather than renewable energy assets. But in the long term, renewable energy is far better.
Okay. So it's not true to say that the sort of simplistic image I have maybe of this is that renewables are more expensive, but good for the environment. So people kind of push them a bit for that reason. And fossil fuels are inexpensive, but bad for the environment. So people kind of suppress them. There's actually a cost benefit to renewables, but it's delayed a bit. So people don't like the long-term thinking aspect of it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, from an investor perspective, that's exactly what we're trying to say. Yes, they need to put the capital up front and they don't want to do that. From a user perspective or consumer perspective, we should all be advocating in favor of renewable energy because in the long term, renewable energy can be about 1/3 of the price of the energy that is generated from fossil fuels. This is what we call the levelized cost of energy. So over its whole lifetime, if we combine the capex with all the opex across all the years that these assets will be generating for, the total cost, which in this case is the area under the curve, will be about 1/3 compared to the cost of fossil fuels. So for us consumers, we would end up paying about 3 times as much if we were buying energy from fossil fuel rather than from renewable energy assets. But
Wow.
from a investor perspective, you don't really care because you're just going to charge the difference to the consumers. And so they're just going to, we are actually paying for these assets anyway.
Wow. Okay. I guess there's other factors as well going into that, like political pressure. I guess certain countries that sell a lot of oil don't necessarily want everybody to be independently using renewables all the time. But there's a big one that we haven't really mentioned here, which is nuclear power. To my understanding, countries like France, for example, will get a lot of their energy from nuclear and it's considered relatively clean. It will, last many decades. Yeah, it makes nuclear waste, but you can get rid of that and bury it and it doesn't take up that much space. What's your thoughts on nuclear? I know probably, firstly, it has a very high startup expense because these reactors are extremely complex. Doesn't it make cheap electricity that is relatively reliable?
My stance on nuclear power plants is that if your country already has them and they're safe to operate, then surely you need to make use of them. Makes perfect sense. But building new nuclear power station makes no sense whatsoever. And I'm going to give you a few bullet points as to why that is. Firstly, building a nuclear power plant takes about 30 years, which means that the decision that I take today as an investor to put my money towards this development, the development of this infrastructure, will not benefit myself, but it will impact the lives of people that live 30 years from today. So to some extent, it's a decision that I'm making on behalf of someone else, which I don't think is fair, but perhaps we can discuss it. And what it means is that this capital is not producing any energy for 30 years. So it's literally wasted capital that could be put towards renewable assets that can be built up in less than 6 years. Secondly, as we said, the operation cost of something like nuclear requires to find the uranium, enhance it, transport it to the site, use it in the process. Then it needs to be meticulously carried out and then stored safely because all the residuals of the process are toxic. So which means that the process is extremely expensive, which makes nuclear about, if I need to throw some numbers out there, nuclear is about 200 pounds per megawatt hour. And when we talk about renewables, we're talking about 80 pounds per megawatt hour. So it's 2 to 3 times more expensive to buy power generated from nuclear. At the same time, those toxins that we have taken away from the nuclear power plants are going to go to occupy a piece of land that is now unable to be used, whether for agriculture or whether for future energy generation. And the use of land is one of the biggest issues that we have in Europe, but that we have all over the world, because land is one of the constraints that limits how much energy we can generate, how much agriculture we can have, how many houses we can have. And so to some extent, the more land, the better.
On that point, isn't nuclear power quite concentrated and it's quite a concentrated and small piece of land that they use, relatively speaking, for the amount of energy they generate compared to like a massive wind farm or a huge solar farm or something, right? It's just on a small site. So isn't that quite efficient? I mean, yeah, you can't use that one site for agriculture, but you don't need many of these things to power a whole country, right?
That is correct. So yes, nuclear power plant is very dense. So if we were looking at megawatts installed per square area, they do very well, which can sound like a really reliable metric. But then there are two other metrics that come up, which one is geopolitical safety. And the second one is the decentralization / distribution of power. So from the first metric, if we are in a military conflict with any other country, having a nuclear power station is extremely dangerous, because if this nuclear power station is destroyed through a military attack, the consequences from an environmental perspective would affect millions of people. So having many renewable assets that are distributed and more decentralized throughout the country means that we can have more sites that even if they lose power and there is a blackout or there is cable issues, it can be easily, their generation can be filled up by nearby assets. So there is a safety concern that nuclear power plants have. The second issue, that then we can have a lot more distributed assets that can power regions that are further from the nuclear power station, rather than having just one central unit that powers millions of people.
Is that an issue? If you have something concentrated, producing power and sending it out, rather than like lots of little things making power all over the country, is it more efficient that way?
So the reason why it is not efficient to have one big power station is that as you transport energy from one location to another, the longer the cables are, the more resistance there is throughout the cables, and so the less energy gets to its final destination. So if you have many small assets, the cables are going to be a lot smaller. Also, from a blackout perspective, if there is a blackout, now there is all the people that were connected to the one asset are out of electricity. While if we have many small assets, it's easier. Smaller regions or smaller neighborhoods of citizens would run out of electricity, which is easier than to fill up with nearby energy generation. If I can add one more thing, because of climate change, there is also some functionality issues with nuclear power stations. Nuclear power stations have a large water usage that is used to cool down the engines as the process takes place. And this is why all nuclear power stations are located alongside rivers or next to the coast. These regulations require that the water that comes from the river or the sea needs to be at a specific temperature, usually below 21 degrees Celsius. But over the last few years, we have seen that because these rivers are reaching over 21, in some cases even 28 degrees Celsius, mostly because of climate change or just because high temperatures in the summer anyways, these nuclear power stations have to be shut down. And France has had several issues throughout the summer because they couldn't use their nuclear power stations.
I guess it makes sense. I guess for the idea of the long-term investor, weren't you just arguing for the idea that the reason that fossil fuel is currently very popular is because of short-term thinking in terms of investment and payoff, right? So should that really be a factor? I mean, if we're thinking in terms of a whole country, I don't think 30 years is that long timescale. You know, there's infrastructure projects that take similar. You're thinking about your kids and your grandkids' futures in terms of that sort of timescale. I mean, yeah, for an investor trying to make money, I guess it doesn't sound great. But for a country national perspective, how does it work? Do national governments fund this stuff, or is it all investor funded?
When we're talking about nuclear power or fossil fuels?
I guess my question is about nuclear power in this context, but I'm really talking about all of these assets.
Back to your question. So 30 years sponsored by the government is not that much. That's a good point. You're off your mic.
Yeah, I'm asking because I genuinely don't know the answer is, are these projects nationally funded, like government funded, or are they investor private funded? I guess probably a bit of both, right?
I think there is both. Both cases are true. I think most of them are owned by private companies because the capex would be too large for a government to undertake. It also depends on the country. For example, in France, they have a monopoly that is controlled by a private company, but then they have the government subsidize and take part of the profits. While in the UK, it's entirely privatized, so every power station is owned by a private group. In China, they do a completely different system where the government subsidizes most projects. I think most of the profit would still be captured by the private groups, if I'm not mistaken. And this is why there is a lot of lobbyists that try to argue why fossil fuels are good and why we need more nuclear power stations. I don't think governments benefit directly from the development of one technology over the other.
It's not often that I sort of hear people who advocate for renewables and the reduction of emissions not being a fan of nuclear, but I guess it makes sense when we have renewables there as another option. Do you think there's such a thing as like a good mix of sources of electricity? You kind of mentioned it earlier, but is it optimal for a country to have maybe 10% nuclear, 5% fossil fuel, 80% renewables, in your opinion?
Yeah, I do a lot of modeling in my research, and there is many other researchers that have done answered this type of question many times with very detailed models. It's almost impossible to get a fully renewable energy powered power system because this would require an incredible amount of batteries to be installed everywhere across the country. And so this is extremely challenging. However, the ideal scenario would be to have 80 to 85% of power coming from renewable energy. And obviously having enough batteries spread across the country so that we can store all the wind that is generated overnight or store some of the solar power that is generated in the middle of the day, and then redistribute that power throughout the peaks of the grid. And usually the peaks are 7 to 9 a.m. when people wake up and they're all going to work, and then 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. when everybody's back home. So these are the two times where the price of electricity is highest and where the demand is highest. So the use of batteries would help us spread the amount of renewable energy that is generated outside of these peaks towards these peaks. As I said, there are still, and in the end, the energy sector is almost a statistical analysis type of work. There is always going to be a few hours throughout the year where there is not enough energy that is generated from renewables, and there is not enough energy stored in batteries. In this case, it is essential to have some dispatchable power, which again comes down to fossil fuels, comes down to, in some case, diesel generators or gas. Going back to nuclear is not a dispatchable power, which means that because the process is so delicate and needs to be maintained at a stable generation level at all times, really difficult to change the output that comes from a nuclear power station. So their generation is consistent over time. So it can be used as a baseload source of energy for the countries that already have it. But for building new nuclear power assets, probably isn't the right way to go about. However, going back to your question, it is extremely important that we have a different power mix, something that relies on wind, solar, hydropower, batteries, fossil fuels around 5%. And having this variability protects us from unpredictable weather as well as price swings.
So there's this variability. There's this optimum sort of mix of energy sources over another. Do governments try and push things one way and another with policy? And do governments try and create that mix in their countries? Is there an active effort to kind of make the mix as optimal as possible, or do they just kind of let investors take over and see what's cheapest? Because that, as you're saying, is probably one of the big problems, right? Because if investors are just allowed to go nuts without any incentivization or pushing one way or another, you're just going to end up with the short-term, as always, investment that pays off quickly. The fossil fuels, that's probably one of the reasons why fossil fuels are so popular, right?
You're exactly right. This is one of the biggest issues that we have in the UK, but that we have all over Europe. Governments are trying to create subsidies or tax rebate schemes that motivate investors to invest in renewable energy. But we have seen in the UK and we've seen in other countries that even when governments are being relatively generous with top-up payments to these different renewable energy assets, not in every country, not every year, there is enough development taking place. So sometimes there are some bids being opened to build renewable energy in specific regions of the country, in the UK, but in the rest of Europe as well. And there isn't enough applicants, or there isn't enough power being bid for, because the companies don't find it economically viable enough, especially when there is fossil fuel that can be sold at significantly higher margin. So from an economical perspective, there needs to be a combination of better narrative, stronger motivation, and also some economical incentive that brings together all of this. Renewable energy, you can often invest in renewable energy through retirement schemes or through bonds. So funds that take your money and then they invest into renewable energy. The returns are relatively average. Usually they talk about 6% per year, which is not a bad return. But when we compare to other investments, they might be less interesting to a potential investor.
So renewables sound great. Obviously, the short-term cost benefit of fossil fuels and the quick access and 24-hour ability to be used is obviously all good things. So they're not all bad. And I can see why, from an investor standpoint, it makes more sense, maybe short-term, to invest in the fossil fuel sector because it's more profitable at the end of the day. You just get a higher return on your investment, right? But I guess if we're thinking even longer term when it comes to the circle back into the climate change question, it's an even bigger reason to start sort of incentivizing or offsetting the cost difference for the renewables, right? Especially if you're saying that nuclear is not the way to go, which is actually something I had not really heard before from people who are interested in climate and environmental and energy policy and science, right? So renewables sound like even more of the way to go than I already thought they were, because I didn't know anything as near as much as about this as you do, of course. The incentivization has to be there for the cost aspect, because at the end of the day, it comes down to cost efficiency and how much money the investors make, because otherwise they won't build the things. Right?
That is true in part. I think there are many things that we can add here. So firstly, that the energy transition and climate change is an opportunity more than a burden. And I think that the UK has done a really good job at reducing gas projects in the North Sea and trying to focus on the especially offshore wind farms, onshore wind farm projects that can be developed and can be extremely profitable. So being energy secure for a country is indispensable. As we said at the beginning, the more energy equals the more GDP, and the more GDP, the wealthier are the citizens in your country. So it is extremely important that we have a way to generate cheap power, as much as possible of it, and making sure that every company and every individual has access to it. Especially as we move towards a world where AI is becoming the everyday tool to do all of our jobs, being able to have companies that are UK-based and they're allowed to develop data centers in the UK, process the data, develop AI technologies in the country, can put the UK in an economically position that it's unique and advantageous compared to the rest of the world. Now, every country, whether you want to push an AI or not, should still be aiming for this energy independence. I think it's obvious. If, as an individual, we want to be involved in the conversation, I also think we should point out that everybody should aim as an individual to become energy sufficient and energy independent to some extent. So what I'm saying by this is that we've been taught to buy electricity and pay our bill every month. But one of the best investments that we can do as an individual is to buy a solar panel, put it on our roof, buy a battery so that we can store the excess solar power that is not used throughout the day while we are at work. We can buy an electric vehicle, and all of a sudden, we are able to generate our own electricity, power our home, power our electric vehicle. Perhaps in the future, if we have an AI agent or a humanoid robot, we can power all of that for free. All of a sudden, you're not paying your bill to anybody, and maybe you're even generating, you're even creating your own services and products within your home. So I think that going forward, energy will be
these all sound brilliant. These all sound brilliant. And this is obviously your forte thing to speak about, but they all sound very expensive as investments for individuals. Yeah, it sounds great that you can have an electric vehicle and a humanoid robot in your house doing things powered by renewable electricity, and all of these things sound awesome, but a solar panel on your roof and you get a tax incentivization to do that. But these things will require you to be quite rich to buy, right?
Yeah. You have identified one of the biggest problems in the energy transition. Part of my research is actually to study how the energy transition increases wealth inequality. And as we have seen over the past few years, there has been many subsidies and tax rebates for people that have been able to buy solar panels, electric vehicles, heat pumps. But unfortunately, the people that have made use of these subsidies were people that were well above the median income of workers in the UK. So what it means is that we have helped people that were already well off buy these assets, and now they're paying less in their energy bill. They're paying less on their stand-up charge on their energy bill. And at the same time, now they have these assets that is helping them potentially even generate an income. In some cases, there are some regions in the UK where you can sell your excess generation from your solar panels back to the grid, and you will get paid just for how much energy you've generated. In the meantime, the rest of the country is now left with no assets and potentially even having to pay for their bill to the people that have bought these solar panels. And so there is a risk where if we don't manage the way in which we deploy these assets, and if we don't make sure that if we distribute them equitably by making sure that the poorer households have better access to this infrastructure before the richer households, there is a risk that the energy transition will be used as a mean to increase wealth inequality. This is an extremely challenging point. I might just finish with this, because whilst we want as many people as possible to buy an electric vehicle to reduce carbon emissions and use electricity instead of gas and diesel, whilst we want that to happen, we would like it to happen for the poorer income households rather than the people that are already well off.
Yeah. I mean, I'm all for that, but what are some of the ways that you are thinking could this be done? Obviously, this is your research, right? So, are there any suggestions you could tell me about or things that you think might work to help reduce the inequality?
Yeah, my field specifically focuses on energy communities. So the idea that different households living in the same neighborhood can come together and share ownership of these assets, whether we're talking about small wind farms, solar panels, batteries, heat pumps. By doing so, especially in a strategic location across the country where there is more grid constraints, which means that there is a very thin margin between generation and demand of electricity, in these regions, the price of electricity is particularly expensive. And although the cost of electricity across the country is the same, because we have a system that allows for the price to be consistent across the country, the price is usually driven up by these regions where there is the most constraint. So if we were able to subsidize or in part these energy communities to be developed, we would help households that live in fuel poverty to have access to renewable energy that is generated locally. They would be able to access it for free. They would be able to provide the surplus to the grid, making the electricity cheaper for everybody else in the country, while benefiting directly and potentially coming out of energy poverty. This is one of the many examples.
That sounds really cool for small communities. What about places like high rises in London, for example, like blocks of flats? Is there any way that people living in these kinds of places could get access to this stuff? Would that policy work for them, or would it be more focused on like little communities?
Yeah, energy communities is optimized for small areas, that small neighborhoods, they usually have some land available. Doesn't necessarily need to be in the countryside, it can also be in urban areas, but it does require some space. If we're talking about skyscrapers in London, obviously there is still space for solar panels on rooftops. And there are some community energy projects, such as the one in Brixton in the south of London, that have tried this and they've been quite successful. But expecting it to work for everybody can be challenging. For
I get that.
Yeah, I think from a urban area perspective, there are more uh, energy efficiency upgrades that need to be taken into account. So making sure that the insulation, window, are and efficiency of appliances is in place is probably the best way to go about this. So making sure that you are able to do the exact same tasks but consume less energy and therefore reduce your electricity bill and put less energy demand onto the grid. That's probably the best
Mm.
way, but obviously it's a very challenging issue to address.
That makes sense. And as long as you can like reduce it a bit for most people, the burden of this, I think that's a good thing. And what you just said about the regulation of efficiency of appliances and things, that's something that you could actually use to force landlords, for example, to reduce the bills for their tenants, because that's a big, part of the population who might suffer from this kind of thing in London, for example. But yeah, I can see that you've thought about it. I think that's a very fascinating thing to be working on. To bring it back around again to the question at the beginning to finish up the pod, we're talking about all the different types of energy. It definitely sounds like, from your perspective and from mine too, from being told about it by yourself, that renewables are the future. The world, that's not necessarily shared by a lot of people. I guess it's cheaper. Having renewables is cheaper long term, of course, as we've talked about. But bang for buck, just buying oil from a country that produces shed loads of it must be cheaper, right? Like, we're talking in terms of production in country. But if a country is pumping out millions of barrels of oil, it must be cheap just to buy from them. And this is the problem, right? We have these places in the world that are pumping out oil. We've now seen unreliability with this, with Russia, with Iran, and the countries in the Gulf. It's become obvious that you can't necessarily rely on that as we used to think we could in the future. The globalized world, it's become less clear that we'll have a consistent and safe supply of these things. Maybe renewables have got a new life breathed into them by these kind of new crises that show that this cheap, big mass-produced oil isn't necessarily as safe as we thought it was. Would you agree?
The crisis in Iran will help the narrative of renewable energy. So you're correct about it.
I'm
still
trying to
think-
say, are we about to enter a new golden age of renewables and renewable thought?
I think we are not yet into a golden age of renewable energy because there is not enough education, I think, for individuals to move towards, for individuals, not necessarily to start energy communities, but to wanting to become energy independent. And so there is not enough services and companies that would support an individual that wanted to become energy independent. And I think because of this reason, many energy groups will still take advantage of people and keep using fossil fuels and charge them more. I do think that although fossil fuels are cheap in the short term, there is a lot of consequences that are not quantified in the price of oil that will impact the country. And so we're talking from CO2 to air quality, pollution in rivers and the environment. And although these ones are not seen on the bill that comes with the oil tanker, it will be seen perhaps in hospital bills. It can be seen in environmental disasters. It can be seen. So I'm not sure if saving those, 20, 30 pounds per megawatt hour with respect to renewable energy actually then saves you that much money if then your citizens are not having the best quality of life that they can. To not also minimize the fact that, as we have seen, you're not in control of your own power, and then there can be spikes in price that can easily make holes in the pockets of the government, because now Rachel Reeves is going to go and give subsidies again for the people that can't pay their energy bill. So she has done it now. She did it with Russia. We did it during COVID. This money in the end is taxpayers' money. So me and you, we're still paying more expensive. It just, instead of coming from our electricity bill, it comes from our taxes. So I'm not sure that the insecurity risk combined with the environmental and health risks justifies the use of fossil fuels to save 30 pounds per megawatt hour.
Yeah. I can also see a big wealth inequality with this, and I'm sure you do too. The countries that use a lot of this oil, use a lot of the fossil fuels, are not the ones who are feeling the effects of these natural disasters that are some of the big consequences of the greenhouse gases and the climate change, right? These are countries in Africa and Asia and South America, for example, where they're seeing huge amounts of climate change-induced weather extreme events, and they are not necessarily the ones who are consuming most of this oil and energy. So yeah, we may be safe in the UK from some of the worst of the extreme weather events, but that doesn't mean we're not causing damage and destruction elsewhere from these things, right?
Yeah. No, you're perfectly right. And I think there's been disasters in Nigeria. There's been disasters in, I think it's Indonesia. They might have had the sea water rise. I don't remember the exact amount of meters, but there are some areas that are now being submerged by water. So it is true that we are not seeing these crazy climate catastrophes in the UK, but they are happening all over the world. One thing that I would like to add is that there are two countries that are relatively quiet about their energy transition, and I think they are in the best position compared to everybody else. The first one is Norway, because I believe they're over 95% renewable energy. They have a lot of hydropower, they have a lot of wind farms. And if I remember correctly, on an article that was published last week, they said that in the month of March, over 7,000 vehicles were sold in Norway. Only 12 of them were ICE, so internal combustion engine. Everything else was electric vehicles or hybrid. I think it was 98% electric vehicles and 1% hybrid, and then 12 combustion engine. And the second country is China. The UK has a peak energy demand of about 45, 46 gigawatts. So that's how much power the whole country consumes. China is building about 40 gigawatts worth of renewable energy every single month. And so they're taking the UK power generation, and every single month they're building a whole UK worth of energy inside their country. And that's just renewable. They're also building coal, they're also building other things, but just the renewable are as much as the UK.
How much energy do they need? Is that not excessive? China's population, I know, is, 10 to 20 times bigger than the UK's, but that seems like a lot of power to be building every month.
Yeah, I think it's also true that probably they started from a baseline of power per capita that was a lot lower than the UK. So they have this need, especially in rural areas, to increase how much generation they have. And they have a growing industry that is moving from manufacturing to heavy manufacturing, so cars, robots, and many other things. And so perhaps they were in deficit before. But I think that the second thing that they understood is that in the future, energy will be more important than it has ever been. Because I think in the past, land was more important. But right now, whichever technology you use, electricity is at the base of it. You cannot do anything without it.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Thanks so much, Fede. That was very fascinating to talk about. And I'm even more convinced on the renewables than I was before this conversation.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear. Obviously, it's a very complicated topic and people can have different opinions. And probably going forward, we'll see a mix of all of the technologies that we mentioned during the podcast. But hopefully the UK will push on renewable power and so will the rest of Europe.
Amazing. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed our discussion. And as always, let us know if you have any questions or you want to hear more about this one. But for now, thanks everybody for listening and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.